It's still
Hello?
coming. Yeah.
Is it on now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Good one.
Yeah,
Yes,
good
it is.
evening. Good evening, Dr. Zuriat. Okay, so we started with cellular adaptation, and we said in summary, cellular adaptation just means different mechanism by which the cell can cope with stress. So the ways by which the cell can just adapt or cope, to stress. And we said the stress can be pathologic or physiologic. So we said this adaptation mechanism is classified into four types: hypertrophy, aplasia, atrophy, metaplasia. And we said dysplasia is not actually a true adaptive mechanism. So it's just like a progression of aplasia or metaplasia. So what does each of them entail? So we said hypertrophy just means an increase in the size of the organ. So the cell is trying to respond to the stress by increasing its size. So the organ is trying to compensate for that stress by increasing its size, its volume. How does it do that? There's an increase in the structural protein and the organelles within those individual cells that is making up the tissue, that is making up the organ. So we said the stressor for hypertrophy can be physiologic or pathologic, and we gave example of physiologic one, somebody that is lifting weight. So if somebody is lifting weight regularly, there's an increased workload on those muscles. How does those muscles respond to that stress, that increased load? They want to increase their size so that they can generate more contractile force to cope with that workload of lifting weight. If you want to lift a weight, you need to generate enough force within your muscle so that you can lift that weight. So how do they do that? They have to undergo hypertrophy. How would they undergo that hypertrophy? They have to increase the size of the individual cells that is making up that bulky muscle. How will they increase the size of the individual cells? They will increase the synthesis of the structural protein and the organelles in the cell. So, what are these proteins that we're even specifically talking about? Myosin and actin. We remember that myosin and actin filaments are the basic contractile units of the muscle that allows it to generate force. So, somebody that is lifting weight, the muscles will undergo hypertrophy so that they can cope with the weight lifting. That's an example of adaptation, cellular adaptation. Another example we gave for the physiologic one is someone that is pregnant. There is uterine hypertrophy. That's a form of adaptation to the pregnancy. Of course, there's a baby that is growing. There is elaboration of hormones from the placenta, like estrogen, which is stimulating the muscle of the uterus, the myometrium, so that it can enlarge to be able to hold that baby. So if the muscle is thin, it can't hold the baby. As the baby is causing stretch, as the baby is growing and is stretching the uterus, for the uterus to be able to contain it, hold it together, it has to undergo hypertrophy. That form of hypertrophy is physiologic, and it is due to the increase in the synthesis of the proteins within the cells that is making up the muscle. So the entire muscles are made up of muscle cells. Yeah, and in each of those cells, we are increasing the amount of myosin and actin filament there, which are the structural proteins, and we're also increasing the amount of mitochondrion, endoplasmic reticulum, ribosome, and all those things, the organelles, so that they can work together to generate more contractile force. Like the mitochondria will help generate more ATP, the endoplasmic reticulum will help generate more protein. And what are these proteins that we are talking about? Actin and myosin filament. So that the actin and myosin filament can be increased in number, they will contract, they will overlap themselves, and they can generate more contractile force to cope with the stress, which is a growing baby. That's physiologic hypertrophy. And we said hypertrophy can also occur in some pathologic setting. So I will not use the setting of this hypertension. Let's say aortic stenosis. So someone has aortic stenosis so that we can be able to relate to that one very well. So if somebody's heart undergoes myocardial hypertrophy due to aortic stenosis, that is a pathologic hypertrophy, because in aortic stenosis there's an obstruction to the outflow from the left ventricle. So it means that the left ventricle has to work more to pump blood from its own cavity into the aorta because of aortic stenosis. What will it do? It will undergo hypertrophy so that it can generate more force to overcome that pressure problem, that stress. How will it do that? It will increase the synthesis of protein and organelles within itself. So in hypertrophy, the clincher there is just increase in the size of the cell due to increase in the synthesis of the structural protein and the individual organelles. not increase in the total number of the cells. So the cells within the muscles, they are 10, but the volume has increased from 10 cubic millimeter to 20 cubic millimeter. So each of the volume of those cells has increased. The number is constant. So if somebody is undergoing an adaptation and there's an increase in the individual numbers of the cells that is making up that tissue, that is hyperplasia, not hypertrophy, because it is a number that is now increasing. The size is constant, but the number has increased. So it can also be physiologic, it can be pathologic. So what are the physiologic explanation that we gave? We said somebody that is undergoing puberty and there's elaboration of some hormones like estrogen, particularly females, and the estrogen are stimulating the glandular epithelial cells of the breast to increase in number. When the glandular epithelial cells are increasing in number, there's going to be an increase in the size of the breast at the end of the day, which signifies the one of the pubertal changes. That is an hyperplastic response, which is physiologic. Another example of okay, so an example of a pathologic apoplastic response is somebody with endometrial hyperplasia. So let's say this person is taking oral OCPs that is containing estrogen, or this person has polycystic ovarian syndrome and there's increased elaboration of estrogen. Estrogen has a trophic effect on the endometrial cells. So it stimulates those cells and they will proliferate more and they will increase in number. So from there you have hyperplasia, and that's a form of adaptive response. So another thing that separates hypertrophy from hyperplasia is that hyperplasia typically occurs in labile cells, cells that are capable of active division. They can keep dividing all over and over again. Hypertrophy is predominantly in cells that they want to adapt, but they are not capable of dividing. So, like cells are the muscle cells, they can undergo hypertrophy only because they are like permanent cells. They rarely divide, once in a while. But hyperplasia, because of the fact that it's more like a proliferative response, you are increasing. There's proliferation of the stem cells and the differentiated cells to produce more of them, so that they can cope with the stressor. So that one typically occurs in cells that are capable of active division, like the epithelial cells. So that is that. And it's because of the fact that it can proliferate rapidly, it can easily progress to cancer, because cancer is problem of uncontrolled cell division. So if a cell is capable of dividing frequently, then it can progress to cancer. So, but it doesn't get to the cancer. It stops at a junction, which is the dysplastic change. So from hyperplasia, they can move to dysplasia, then to cancer. That's about hyperplasia. Hypertrophy doesn't move to cancer. Yeah, so atrophy is not like the opposite of both of them combined. So atrophy is an adaptive response that is assured a reduction in the size and a reduction in the number. So there's a reverse of both hyperplasia and hypertrophy. So that one can be either you are no longer stimulating that tissue. Maybe from you have cut off the nerve and the metabolic activity in that tissue is reduced. The body will need to conserve energy by reducing the mass of those cells, because when the body is not using something, it should not be there and be consuming energy. So we need to reduce the number of those cells so that we can reduce their metabolic demand. That's just the way. So if if there's a denervation of a tissue and it's no longer functionally stimulated and it's no longer active, we need to take down that tissue through the process of atrophy. If a tissue is not getting blood supply, is not getting enough nutrient to participate in metabolism, it needs to go down. If a tissue is no longer hormonally stimulated, it's not functioning again, it has to go down. Poor nutrition, it has to go down. It's not being used, disused, it has to go down. So disuse, denervation, loss of blood supply, loss of hormonal stimulation, poor nutrition. Then we also added that with respect to this poor nutrition, we talked about malignancy said there. So someone that has a malignancy, there's elaboration of some cytokines like TNF1, like interleukin 1 and 6. And those guys, particularly TNF1, has an appetite suppressing effect. So people with cancers, because of the elaboration of TNF cytokines, they don't feel the urge to eat. So they look wasted, they look cachetic because of the poor nutritional status. They are not eating. So because of the fact that they are not eating, they have a poor nutritional state that triggers atrophy of the tissues, the cells in someone that has a cancer. So what is the mechanism for atrophy? We have said it. It is due to reduction in the number of the individual cells and the size of those cells. So how did they achieve reduction in the size first? Because we have said that for us to achieve an increase in the size of the cell, we have to increase the amount of protein that is there and the organelles. So if we want, it's logical to say that if we want to reduce the size, break off the protein, break off the organelles. So the way we can reduce the protein is to, number one, reduce protein synthesis. That one is straightforward. Or we break off the protein that's already there. How do we break off the protein? Two ways. Is either we target that cell for cytoskeletal, because cytoskeleton is actually protein. Yeah. So we target it for once you damage the cytoskeleton, damage all the proteinaceous content in the cell. And how do you achieve that? You need a protease enzyme. So how do you want to do that? You just label those cells via the ubiquitin pathway. So we attach ubiquitin to those cells that we want to break off their cytoskeletal protein. And once we attach ubiquitin to that cell will be forced to move to the proteasome, which is an organelle that has some protease activity. So once we have labeled a cell uh to to have suffered maybe loss of blood supply or loss of hormonal stimulation and want to take it out, want to reduce the protein that is there, want to cleave the protein, we attach ubiquitin to it, and ubiquitin we take it to the proteasome, and the proteasome we damage the cytoskeleton. By that way, we have reduced the proteins that are there. So if we want to take out the organelles, we need to now make it undergo autophagy. So autophagy is a process by which the lysosomes start digesting the individual organelles within the cell. So they try to form autophagic vacuole. So they capture one organelle mitochondrion, they chop it off, capture endoplasmic reticulum, chop it off, capture. So that's like self-eating autophagy, because it is the lysosome within the cell that is taking those individual organelles down. So if we are taking the organelles down, we are taking the proteins down, we are achieving a reduction in the size of the cell. And we have said atrophy doesn't involve that only. It also associated with a reduction in the number of the cell. So how do we achieve reduction in the number of the cell? That's when apoptosis kicks in. So it is apoptosis that is a pattern of cell death that actually helps to reduce the number of cells in atrophy. Apoptosis. We should not forget, not necrosis, but apoptosis. So that's that about atrophy. Um, Metaplasia is another form of adaptive response. So, for example, what is a stressor for metaplasia to happen? Somebody is smoking. Smoking is a stressor because it is causing injury to the cell, particularly the airway. It's causing injury to the epithelial cells of the airway. So what are the epithelial cells of the airway? What are them? What are those epithelial cells rather specifically? So epithelial cells are the pseudostratified squamous, pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Those are the cells that lines the airway, of the respiratory tract. So if they are exposed to smoking for a long time, they cannot cope with that smoke irritation. They need to adjust. So the way they adjust is that they undergo reprogramming. They change their form. So they differentiate from one cell type to another cell type to another cell type that can handle that stressor. That is metaplasia. So metaplasia is actually with reprogramming of the stem cells to be able to differentiate from one cell type to another cell type that's capable of handling that stressor. So we give an example of someone that's smoking now. The initial cell that is there are the pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. When smoking comes in, the columnar cells cannot handle smoke, so they need to change to stratified squamous epithelial cell that can handle it. So if the stem cells within the um, epithelium of the respiratory tract are now changing from those ones that are differentiating the pseudostratified to those ones that are differentiating they are changing from those ones that can produce stratified squamous, stratified columnar rather, sorry about that guys, stratified columnar, to the ones that can differentiate to stratified squamous. That is a metaplastic change because stratified squamous can undo the smoke irritation, while pseudostratified columnar cannot handle it. Another one is Barrett esophagus, which is a situation where there is incompetency of the lower esophageal sphincter. So it cannot handle the reflux of acid from the stomach into the esophagus. That acid is irritating the esophagus. And the esophagus is lined by stratified squamous epithelium. The stomach is lined by simple columnar. So what would they do? they will try to differentiate into the cells of the esophagus will now try to differentiate into the cells of the stomach so that it can handle the acid. So it will now move from stratified squamous to simple columnar. That is a metaplastic change. That's a metaplastic change, and we call that esophagus. So one thing about metaplasia is that it is a potential fertile ground for cancer to also develop. So metaplasia, just like hyperplasia, can also go to dysplasia and now progress to cancer. In what situation? When the stimulus, when the stressor is persistent. So if they get exposed to that stressor for a long time, it will be forced to move from the hyperplastic response that they are undergoing or the metaplastic response to dysplastic change and to malignancy. Then before I move from hyperplasia, like I said the last time, please you should not forget, benign prostatic hyperplasia is one of those hyperplastic response that does not progress to dysplasia or cause cancer. No, no. Yeah, that is very important to remember. And metaplasia is not confined to epithelial cells only, like epithelial cells of the lungs or epithelial cells of the esophagus. It can also occur in connective tissue or mesenchymal cells. And that is what brings about the example of the myositis ossificans, in which you have a metaplastic change within a connective tissue. Which connective tissue? Bone. So if somebody suffers fracture and there's break within the bone, the next thing is sorry, the metaplastic change is within the muscles rather. So if somebody suffers muscle injury, maybe from a fracture and there's damage to the muscle, we are supposed to have healing of the muscle. So muscle should replace itself with another new muscle. But that trauma can cause a metaplastic change in which you now have some of those muscle cells, the stem cells of the muscle now differentiating into bone cells that are now replacing the lost muscle. That's a metaplastic change because you are having change in connective tissue from one cell type to another. Instead of the muscle going to muscle, they are now going to bone. So it's now moving from muscle to bone. That is metaplastic change of a connective tissue. We are not going to call that epithelial tissue or epithelial cell because muscles and bone are not epithelial cells. They are mesenchymal cells. So don't forget, myositis ossificans, which is ossification of a muscle, deposition of bone in a muscle is a metaplastic response. Do not forget that. And it's not due to affection of epithelial cells, but connective tissue or mesenchymal cells. Very, very important. Very, very important. So, before we leave, we have said Barrett esophagus is a metaplastic change, and which is due to reflux of acid into the stomach. That Barrett esophagus, which is an esophagus that is containing simple columnar epithelium, can now go to dysplastic change and develop into cancer. So that is why someone that is having reflux esophagitis can progress to Barrett's esophagus and have esophageal adenocarcinoma, which is the cancer that happens. Someone that is smoking excessively, they can have a metaplastic change of their respiratory epithelium from pseudostratified ciliated columnar to stratified squamous epithelium. That one can now progress to dysplasia and now cause stratified what's it called? Can now cause squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus. So from respiratory ciliated columnar epithelium to stratified squamous epithelium to a dysplastic change to squamous cell cancer. That is that. Then we said dysplasia typically occurs in epithelial cells. So dysplasia only occurs in epithelial cell. Dysplasia only occurs in epithelial cell. And what is that about dysplasia? Dysplasia is just when you have disordered precancerous epithelial cell growth. So when the epithelial cell growth are now becoming disordered, and they are progressing to malignancy, and they have tendency of progressing to malignancy, we call that dysplastic change. It is not a true adaptive response. It is not. It's just an intermediate, to cancer because all this metaplasia, atrophy, hypertrophy, hyperplasia, they are reversible. There's a level of dysplasia that once you get there, it's not reversible anymore. And dysplasia doesn't help to even cope with the stress. It can even worsen. It doesn't help to even manage with any stress. It's not a true adaptive response. It's more like a precursor to a cancer. What are the changes that we see that can make us say that this cell is undergoing dysplasia? We said we are going to look at it cell entirely as a whole, and we are now going to focus on the nucleus. So what are the things that we are going to see, looking at the cell as a whole? We are going to notice that the shape of the cell will be irregular. So there will be lots of uniformity of the cell shape and also less of uniformity of the cell size. So we are going to be seeing big cells, small cells, instead of everything just being uniformly of the same size, the same shape. So some will be rectangular, some will be square, some will be triangle, and some will be big, some will be small. So lots of uniformity of the cell shape and the shape, which we call pleomorphism, and that will cause a disruption of the tissue orientation. Then we are now going to look at the nucleus. So we are going to notice that the nuclear cytoplasmic ratio is going to be higher than normal, which is number one. There's an increase in the nuclear cytoplasmic ratio for that cell. So the nucleus is going to appear very big than normal. And we are going to notice that there will be clumping of the chromatin within the nucleus. So once we see that, we know that that is likely to be a dysplastic change within that cell. And we said it can be graded grade 1 or grade 1 or mild, moderate, grade 2, and grade 3 severe. So if you are talking about mild hypertrophy, that means sorry, I said hypertrophy, dysplasia. The mild dysplasia is typically occurring, within the cells that are most proximal, those ones that are topmost. That's where the dysplasia is happening. When it gets to the middle layer, it is moderate. When it gets to the ones that are at the base, from up to down, it's now moving from up to down. Now it's now at the base. That is the severe form of dysplasia or carcinoma in situ. It becomes carcinoma in situ, and once it breach the basement membrane, that is just the blue line, beneath all the cells. You can see this blue line. That's the basement membrane. Once it breached the basement membrane, that is invasive carcinoma. That's like pure cancer. That's cancer now. But once this plastic change gets to the base, it has not even breached the membrane, but it's at the base. That is severe dysplasia or carcinoma in situ. It's irreversible at that point. It is irreversible at that point. So, and the progression actually deals with how persistent you are getting exposed to the stressor. So if there's a background hyperplasia or there's a background metaplasia and the person is still getting exposed to what is causing the metaplastic change or the hyperplastic change, it can progress to dysplasia, and dysplasia can get to cancer. Then we talked about cell injury. We said it can be reversible or irreversible, reversible or reversible. So we said there are some things that can, cause reversible cell injury. So it's like a progression. You start from the reversible phase and get to the irreversible phase. And it usually occur when the adaptive mechanism becomes maladaptive. It's no longer able to handle that stress. The stress is just becoming too much. You know, the cells will eventually die. For example, someone is having uh um let's say myocardial hypertrophy, which is a response to let's say aortic stenosis or hypertension. Let's say aortic stenosis is undergoing hypertrophy. Now, in aortic stenosis, there's less cardiac output because blood is not going to go out of the um enough blood is not going to move from the left ventricle into the aorta. So that means that there's virtually less blood being delivered to the heart, doing that to for it to get filled because cardiac output will reduce. So that will cause ischemic damage to the heart muscle because the metabolic demand of the heart muscle will be higher than normal. It has undergone hypertrophy. It needs more oxygen. It needs more glucose. It needs more nutrient to function than a normal muscle. So if there's less delivery of oxygen, there's less oxygen to participate in the oxidative phosphorylation pathway that we talked about in biochemistry. That means that there's less generation of ATP. So if ATP drops, we talked about the activity of the sodium potassium ATPase pump on all the cells of the body. So which is responsible for helping us move sodium against its concentration gradient. That is, move sodium from where it is small to where it is big. And we know that sodium is an extracellular anion. So that ATP helps to move sodium from the intracellular space to the extracellular compartment where it is big. So it means that if there's no ATP, there's no way we can move sodium from the intra to the extracellular site. So that means that sodium will start pulling in the intracellular space. And sodium is osmotically active and it will want to draw water to itself. So when it draws water into the cell, there's going to be cellular swelling. So that is why cellular swelling is the earliest morphologic manifestation of reversible cell injury. So we just know that all the cells are becoming swollen up because of that sodium accumulating in water. So what will happen? It will attack the cell membrane, and you are going to notice that, okay, fluid. Let's just picture that fluid is now filling the cell membrane and is now causing it to bleb out. It's forming some outpouching because of fluid that is filling into those spaces. So we notice that the cell membrane starts forming blebs. We notice that some of those organelles action becomes disturbed. So there's disturbance in the structure of some of those organelles, like the endoplasmic reticulum. There's going to be the ribosome being detached from the endoplasmic reticulum. So there's less activity of the endoplasmic reticulum, which is protein synthesis. So protein synthesis stops or reduces because of the fact that the endoplasmic reticulum is now becoming enlarged and there's detachment of the ribosomes there. We talked about the plasma cell changing, which is the blebbing. Then the nucleus too will undergo clumping. So just like what we're having in dysplasia, we notice that there's clumping of the chromatin in the nucleus. And we said this chromatin clumping is actually due to the fact that this cell that is no longer having ATP from oxidative phosphorylation will now be forced to be getting some small ATP from anaerobic pathway. And we said the metabolic product of anaerobic pathway is what? Is lactic acid. So the lactic acid will drop the pH, and whenever the pH of the cell is dropped or is acidic, it causes chromatin clumping. Then we talked about the fact that, okay, there will be rapid loss of function grossly. That is a gross manifestation, which is normal. The example we gave was the hypertrophied left ventricle with reduced cardiac output, with reduced delivery of blood and oxygen to the left ventricle and the muscle. So that means that once that happens, the muscle will fail. The muscle will fail, and the person will start presenting with MI and all those things. So loss of function eventually happens, and or myocardial ischemia rather, and the person starts having chest pain and all those things. Then we talked about generation of free radicals attacking those what is it called, the lipid within those organelles. So the membrane of the endoplasmic reticulum, the membrane of the mitochondrion, they get exposed to free radicals that attack them and cause peroxidation of their lipids, which eventually lead to formation of myelin figures. So these myelin figures are just aggregation of peroxidized lipids, like these lipids that have been exposed to free radicals. So they accumulate together and they deposit within the cytoplasm of the cell. So what we are looking out for reversible cell injury: cellular swelling, endoplasmic reticulum is damaged, there's no protein synthesis, mitochondrion too is damaged, um, the nucleus starts clumping, the membrane starts blebbing. Once they are saying that, that is reversible change. But in irreversible, you notice that everything is like destroyed totally. Everything is destroyed. So you're having destruction of these blebs. So the plasma membrane that's already blebbing will get, destroyed. So when it gets destroyed, that means that all the cellular content will escape into the environment. They will escape into the extracellular space. So, for example, if you are looking at a myocardial cell, part of the enzyme that we have in a myocardial cell includes troponin. So, when a myocardial cell suffers irreversible injury like myocardial infarction, you have damage of those plasma membrane of those cells, and you have leakage of those cytosolic enzymes like troponin. So that is why troponin is used as a marker to make diagnosis of MI. We said that you cannot use troponin to make diagnosis of myocardial ischemia, because in ischemia the injury is reversible, but in MI there's already necrosis, there's death already. So there's already damage to the plasma membrane. So those enzymes have leaked out and you can detect them. So what happens when there's leakage of the cellular content? There's space for calcium to also come in from the extracellular compartment into the cell. And we said when those enzymes even leak out, you trigger inflammation. And in addition to that, you have influx of calcium into the cell. And we said calcium activates enzymes, particularly protease enzymes and phospholipase. So once those enzymes are activated, then you are releasing armor. You are using like a knife or something for the cell to now eventually kill itself finally. So those derivative enzymes like the protease enzyme, the phospholipase, they are now going to now start destroying the mitochondrion. Will start destroying the endoplasmic reticulum. They start destroying everything else, degrade the cell completely. So if they take care of all the mitochondrion, you have no electron transport chain again, and there's absolutely no ATP again. when you destroy the lysosome, they rupture. When they rupture, they release their own hydrolytic enzyme. We know that's the function of lysosome. It's just to be degrading things, and it has hydrolytic enzyme that can help it with that. So when there's a break in in the membrane of the lysosome, they become destroyed. They release their own hydrolytic enzyme into the cell, and the cell is now going to use those hydrolytic enzymes to now further destroy itself. It will now further use those enzymes to destroy itself, causing autolysis. And we said the nuclear change that happens in reversible cell injury occurs in three phases, unlike the nuclear change that occurs in dysplasia and reversible, which is just nuclear chromatin clumping. But here we have those three stages: pekinosis, cryoexis, and cryolysis. So what happens in um, pekinosis? There's condensation of the chromatin only. That's the earliest one. The chromatin just starts condensing, it starts getting condensed, and the next thing you start having the endonuclease enzyme coming in, causing breakage of those chromatin into fragments. So nuclear fragmentation is cryoexis. So they fragment into irregular forms and they are separated, they are kind of distributed within the cytoplasm. Then later, you will not even see the chromatin again, you will not even see the nucleus again. They have been destroyed totally, which is the cryolysis. So the first thing is pekinosis, condensation of the chromatin, so that you can condense them in one form, prepare them for the fragmentation. So later, you now employ the activity of endonuclease to fragment them, which is the cryoexis. Then later, you have complete disappearance of all the nucleus material, which is cryolysis. Then we said when the phospholipase enzyme, the protease enzyme are coming in, they can destroy the lipid membrane, for example, that of the mitochondrion, and those lipid fragments can chelate calcium that is coming in to form amorphous densities that deposit within the mitochondria. That one might not be relevant. You might remember that, but don't forget all the other things that we've talked about. This calcium entry is very important. Leakage of the cytosolic enzyme is very important. So the way to figure it out is just to always remember that in irreversible cell injury, the most important thing is the fact that you must always say that there's a breakdown in the plasma membrane. So once that plasma membrane is being established, you know that that's an irreversible problem. There's nothing the cell can do to redeem itself. So it's already irreversible. So once the plasma membrane gets damaged, enzymes come in. Enzymes leave, then calcium comes in. So once calcium comes in, it will activate more protease enzyme to start degrading the cell. Lysosome get degraded, mitochondrion get degraded, all the organelles you can think of get degraded. But what happens to the nucleus? The nucleus undergoes three stages: pekinosis, which condenses, fragmentation, cryolysis, and cryolysis, which is eventual disappearance of the nucleus. Then we talked about different pathways of cell death. So we said cell can die through apoptosis and necrosis. So we said apoptosis is actually very important for cells that we know that they have been programmed to die by some particular time. So when this cell gets to this time, it will die by this time. So by that program cell death, that's apoptosis. So when you say you have programmed the cell to die at this particular time, you know the time where it's going to die is going to die by apoptosis. So we said it requires three pathways: the intrinsic, the extrinsic, and the perforin and B pathway. And all of them actually culminate in activation of the caspase enzyme. Those are cytosolic proteins that degrade the protein. So from the name, cytosolic protein degrades the protein within the cell. So what are those pathways? The intrinsic pathway, extrinsic, perforin. So we said intrinsic pathway is related to triggers that are intrinsic to the cell. Okay, is it that embryogenesis is happening? Embryogenesis, we know that some cells will die at some particular time and they will not be in the baby by the time the baby is delivered. They are just there, during the period of development. Once there's eventual formation of the baby and the fetus is complete, they're already gone. So, for example, we give example of thyroglosal dot. It doesn't persist to, to full development. It will regress at some time. And we said another example is the notochord. Notochord will die at some time. So all those cells, they die off by the intrinsic pathway. We said another example for intrinsic is when there's an inflammatory response and, after some time, we need the inflammatory cells to go off, to die, because we don't want them to persist. Once the regulatory factor that is stimulating their production has been taken off. So if there's sepsis and there's release of interleukin 2, and interleukin 2 is driving production of B cells, T cells, and all those things. Once the inflammatory response is taken care of, the sepsis has resolved, interleukin-2 level has dropped. So all those cells that has released, they have to go down to like the T cells and the B cells. So those ones will die by apoptosis too. It's an intrinsic thing. Then the last thing is when we said um, when the exposure of DNA and protein to noxious substances, noxious stimuli, injurious stimuli like radiation, toxin, hypoxia, or protein misfolding. So if we expose our DNA to radiation or toxin or infection or anything, and the problem with the DNA, the cells that are contain those DNA will have to die by apoptosis. That is it. And when there's misfolding of protein for any reason, they have to die by apoptosis. You know, and we talked about the factors that are regulating apoptosis through the intrinsic pathway. We said we have the back and the BAX protein, the BAX and the BAC protein. So those ones are there in the outer membrane of the mitochondria. So what they do is that because we said the intrinsic pathway involves the mitochondria. So what they do is that when there's problem with maybe the problem with DNA or embryogenesis, they activate the P53. P53 will now activate these BAC and BACs. When there's activation of BAC and BAC, they will make pores within the mitochondria so that an enzyme can escape from the mitochondria, which is cytochrome C. When cytochrome C escapes from the mitochondria, it's going to bind to ATP in the cytoplasm. And once cytochrome C binds with the ATP, it's going to activate the caspases, which are the cytosolic proteins that we have talked about. So what are those things that caspase is now going to do? It's going to come down and do two things. Because the protease enzyme is going to destroy all the cytoskeletal protein in the cell. All the organelles in the cell that's containing protein and all the cytoskeletal structures are going to be taken care of. So damaging that will reduce the size of. We remember when we were talking about apoptosis, we said once you degrade cytoskeletal protein by ubiquitin, the cell will reduce in size. The same thing is happening here. Once the caspase destroys those cytoskeletal protein, it's going to cause shrinking of the cell. That's the first thing that you see in apoptosis. Unlike in necrosis or irreversible cell injury. Sorry, I forgot to mention, irreversible cell injury is also necrosis. So in that one, the first thing that we see is what, although it will have been starting from reversible to irreversible, but the cell will have already become swollen. So necrosis is cellular, swelling, while apoptosis is shrinking of the cell. Those are one of the differences that you are going to see. If you try to read the literatures, you see apoptosis cellular shrinking, necrosis cellular swelling. So because of the damage to the cytoskeletal protein, what will it do to the nucleus? It's going to cause the nuclear changes that is also in necrosis that we talked about, or reversible cell injury. It's just that the last one will not be there. It's going to cause pykinosis, which is one of the characteristic features. There's condensation of the nuclear material, and there's nuclear fragmentation. Those two things are there. Then later, it's now going to cause formation of cytoplasmic blebs that are containing some portion of these organelles. The reason why they are forming these blebs is to be able to, break the cell into tiny bits so that those tiny bits will now be taken care of by the macrophages. And you are killing off a cell without provoking any inflammatory response. You are triggering up, we are not damaging the cell membrane, so there's no leakage of any material. Yeah, we are just forming blebs from the membrane. We are just forming blebs from the membrane, and those blebs are containing some portion of the organelles of the cell, and those blebs are going to be eaten up by the macrophages. So that means that in apoptosis, there's no inflammatory response. But in necrosis or irreversible cell injury, there's inflammatory response. So that is that about the intrinsic pathway. They form the caspase, dissolve the cytoskeleton, makes the cell shrink. The cytoskeleton are also going to destroy almost all the protein in the cell, including RNA. So if RNA is taken care of in the cytoplasm, and we've said it that RNA and DNA stain basophilic. So if RNA is gone, all the proteins in the cell are gone. There's nothing to take the what's it called? The basophilic stain. So they will appear eosinophilic. So the cytoplasm will appear eosinophilic. But because we said that the nuclear change in apoptosis is majorly pykinosis and karyoexis. So the condensed nucleus is going to take up, because they contain condensed DNA and RNA within them, the nucleus. Those ones will take up the basic dye and they are going to stain basophilic. So the characteristic staining in a apoptotic body is what? A deeply basophilic nucleus and a deeply eosinophilic cytoplasm. Very, very important. So yeah, so that's that about the intrinsic pathway. So what about the and we said we also have some other proteins that antagonize the action of the back and the backs, which are the ones that prevent apoptosis. So those are the BCL2 and the BCLXL. So those ones inhibit activity of back and back. So it means that if they inhibit back and back, that means they are not triggering apoptosis. So it makes sense for us to say that there can be some malignancy that can be utilizing the BCL2. So the BCL2 and the BCLXL, they are anti-apoptotic because they inhibit back and back. So if a cell wants to live for life, it doesn't want to die, it has to activate BCL2 so that it doesn't undergo death by apoptosis, so that it can live for life. So an example of that is follicular lymphoma, which is a form of malignancy, a form of neoplastic cell. So and that one it's actually formed by translocation between chromosome 14 and chromosome 18 within the B cells. Chromosome 18 is the one that is coding for this BCL2. So it just translocate into the immunoglobulin chain and it will make those B cells existing for life because they will not die by apoptosis. Because BCL2 is an anti-apoptotic protein. So if its action is continuing for life, that means that that cell that is containing an anti-apoptotic protein will not undergo apoptosis and it will live for life. So the extrinsic pathway was mentioned when we were talking about death by extrinsic cause. So let's say we're having an infection from outside now that is coming in. Okay, so don't let me use that one. Let's just because before we used to marry the perforin and the granzyme with the extrinsic pathway, but now that they have been separated. But we should just know that the extrinsic pathway is also known as the death receptor pathway. So that is the one that is using the interaction between the TNF alpha and the TNF alpha receptor, or the fast ligand and the fast protein interaction. So the fast protein is a form of receptor that interact with the fast ligand. So they are under the family of the TNF receptors. So they are very important in killing lymphocytes. So is that yes? So there's something I didn't mention in the last stuff. So in addition to helping us achieve peripheral tolerance, that is helping us taking care of self-reacting T lymphocytes in the thymic cortex, the fast ligand and the fast protein, or the TNF receptor and the TNF alpha, helps to actually control the population of the T cell. So they also help to control the population of the T cells. So if T cells have, gone through immune response and that, and they want to die, they actually die by apoptosis through the activity of this fast ligand. So, so that is why this autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome actually encompasses failure of eradication of T cells following an immune response, or failure of eradication of our self-reacting T cell. So that is why you might see a question that they will just put it there that there's failure of the fast something something interaction, and there is the person having an autoimmune disease. How does that come by? So it can be due to the fact that okay, maybe you are not eradicating self reacting T cell, or you are not eradicating T cell at all. T cell that's even supposed to die normally. Even LDT cells that are not self-reacting, that are supposed to die normally, you are not taking care of them. They are not dying. So they will persist. So one thing about those T cells is that once they are not dying and they are persisting and they are traveling toward the lymphoid organ, they will become self-reacting too. They can undergo that transformation. So that's the mechanism of this autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome. So and when we don't have death of those T cells, they just travel to the liver, cause hepatomegaly, travel to the spleen, splenomegaly, travel to the lymph node, lymphadenopathy. So those are the areas that they first travel to first, because they can't die, because they need this fast and this fast ligand interaction to die. Because once we have this fast ligand, fast receptor interaction, they can activate caspase. So caspase will now do all those things that we have talked about. It will cause damage to the cytoskeleton and the nuclear chain so that the cells can form apoptotic body and get killed by the macrophage. But if you don't have that fast interaction, you cannot activate caspase. You cannot activate caspase through the extrinsic pathway or the death receptor pathway. So there's no way we can take care of those T cells. So they will persist, and they can cause lymphadenopathy, hepatosplenomegaly, and some of them will go haywire and they will start attacking cell antigens like the bone marrow and cause autoimmune cytopenia. So just know that they can cause any autoimmune disease. They can cause any autoimmune disease. So once you see the question tilting towards autoimmune disease and they are mentioning fast ligand, you know that it's likely to be autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome. So please, we should keep that at the back of our mind. So, hello?
Okay.
Okay, so we should not limit it to cytopenias only. It's not only the bone marrow that it can affect any organ. So that's why you can see SLE, you can see rheumatoid arthritis, you can see anything. Very important. So the last one is this perforin granzyme B. So how will this perforin granzyme B activate caspase? Because we said it, that's a common final pathway of those three pathways. Intrinsic will activate caspase. Extrinsic will activate pathway through the fast ligand and the TNF interaction. The perforin granzyme 2 will activate caspase. So perforin granzyme and extrinsic, they are like the same thing. Both of them are actually taking care of cytotoxic T cell as well as natural killer cells because they are the ones that release this perforin. So sorry, they are taking care of cells that are labeled to die by the cytotoxic T cell and the natural killer cells. So once a cell has been labeled to die by the cytotoxic T cell and natural killer cell, when that cell attached to the T cell and the natural killer cell, the next thing is the cytotoxic cell or the natural killer cell will now release this perforin and granzyme B. So what will happen? Perforin will go to that cell that the cytotoxic T cell wants to kill, and it will make holes within it so that granzyme B can enter it. So once granzyme B enter it, it will now go and activate the caspase within that cell that they want to kill. So the caspase will now start activating the apoptotic pathway. They will form apoptotic body until they kill that cell totally. So that's that. I know we'll not be able to finish our revision before we go. So let's just continue.
Dr. Mawale,
Yes, Dr. Precious.
Dr.
Yeah,
Mawale,
yes.
please, how did you link? I didn't get how you linked Grazam B to activation of CASP.
Which one?
CASP spaces, I be CAP spaces.
Yeah,
This did he?
Grazambia B. So what is happening is that
Yes.
so the cytotoxic T cell or
Sorry,
the
sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Bawala, sorry.
Dr. Morabe.
Dr. Miriam has been outside. She has been outside too. I don't know if Dr. Toby can
She has been
add
what?
her to the. She's been waiting to be let into the.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I don't
I,
know. Maybe someone
I
can
don't
help
know
us
who asked.
message Dr. Toby. Dr. Toby
Dr.
is not.
Toby.
Yes, maybe she's busy with something. Dr. Zuriat, will you help us message Dr. Toby? Or maybe just help us call her.
Yeah, no.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Yeah, so Dr. Precious, so this T cell will attach to the cell that they want to kill. So when they attach to that cell, they will now release this enzyme, perforin and granzyme B. So what will perforin do? Perforin will now come and make hole, within that cell. You can see perforin from the name, it makes hole. So when it perforates that cell, it's actually to create a pathway for granzyme B to be able to enter. So once granzyme B enters, what will it do? It will now go and activate the caspase. So granzyme B doesn't activate caspase through cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is for the mitochondrial pathway. Do you get? So granzyme B is the one that is activating the caspase. You know that the final common pathway for the apoptosis is how they will activate caspase. Do you get it, Dr. Precious?
Yes, I get it.
So caspase is the end goal. Regardless of the pathway that you are talking about, it is how they will activate caspase that we are looking at. So it's the granzyme B that will activate the caspase that will now take it up from there. So necrosis is the pattern of irreversible cell death that we have talked about, and it follows when someone had irreversible cell injury, there is damage to the plasma membrane, there's leakage of the enzyme, calcium comes in, starts degrading everything, and of course, because of the cellular content that have leaked through the plasma membrane that is damaged, there's going to be a local inflammatory reaction. Unlike in apoptosis where there's no inflammatory process, because the membrane in apoptosis is intact. It is intact. So, what are the type of necrosis that I want to look out for on histology? Coagulative, liquefactive, caseous, fat, fibrinous, and gangrenous. So, we said coagulative necrosis typically occur when the insult that's causing the cell death is due to ischemia. So when there's obstruction to blood flow to a cell, that cell will die by coagulative necrosis, provided that the cell is not actually within the brain. So if it's the brain that is suffering the hypoperfusion, the brain is going to die by liquefactive necrosis, not by coagulative necrosis. So what are the clinchers for coagulative necrosis? That hypoxic insult, the ischemia, is going to denature all the enzyme in the cell. So the only thing that will happen in the cell is that, okay, the membrane will get damaged, because we know that it is a progression. In irreversible damage, the cells are already getting, the membrane are already forming the plebs. So, and we know that bleb formation is not mediated by the enzyme. It's just that the cells are swelling. So by the time it progresses to irreversible or necrosis, it's already getting severe. So the blebs will now rupture, the membrane will rupture, and cellular content will, spill out, and calcium will come in to activate the cell enzyme, the protease enzyme in the cell. But because of this ischemia, all those protease enzymes will have been denatured. So there's no way for us to now have eventual dissolution of those cells. So there's no way the lysosome will be destroyed. There's no way the endoplasmic reticulum will destroy all those things. So that means that the cellular architecture will be preserved in someone that has coagulative necrosis. So once you see that in a question and they're saying there's preservation of cellular architecture on histology, you know that that's in keeping with coagulative necrosis. They might paint a scenario of coagulative necrosis, infarct to the kidney, and they will tell you which of the following changes are you going to observe on histology. A, preservation of the cellular architecture. B, condensation of the nucleus. C, increased cytoplasmic basophilic staining. D, formation of cystic spaces and cavitation. E, saponification of fat or combination of calcium. We already know what we are looking for. Preservation of the cellular architecture is what we are looking for. And in coagulative necrosis, the whole changes of the nucleus will happen from pykinosis to cryoexis to cryolysis. So the cell is going to disappear completely in coagulative necrosis. It's going to go off. You won't have any cell there. You won't have any nucleus there, rather. And we have said it that nuclear change is not dependent on any enzyme. It will happen on its own. It's not dependent on any enzyme. And we said the way you can now picture the staining for coagulative necrosis, the way you can remember it is by two ways. Because of the fact that the proteins are denatured. Number one, denatured protein will always pick up eosinophilic stain. So if a protein is denatured, the cells there are going to be staining eosinophilic. That's one. If we don't remember that, we can say that, okay, the nucleus is gone. Although nucleus is not cytoplasm, but you can just link it that, okay, nucleus is gone. And we said nucleus is what contains DNA, RNA. And those guys, they stain basophilic. So if there's nothing to stain basophilic again, it means that the cell will be staining eosinophilic. But what I just want to call our attention to is that it is actually the cytoplasm that is staining eosinophilic, because the nucleus is already gone. It's already gone. So eosinophilic staining of the cytoplasm with preservation of cellular architecture is what defines coagulative necrosis. So I think we are going to stop there so that we can attend our prayer meeting. We are going to continue with our amyloidosis, or just rush the revision a little, then start our inflammation, because inflammation is a new topic. It's a separate topic on its own. It's quite different from what we have been doing. So we need to remind ourselves of what has been happening so far before we can move to the inflammation. So the new people that are just joining us, I know that we might not be able to catch the full content of what we are saying. So I just employ us to try to go to the website and try to watch the 3 videos that we have pre-recorded, so we can actually understand those pathways very well because we took time to explain them. This is more like a revision and a rush, so we might not be able to follow very well. But once we go back to the videos, we emphasize those things. We talked about them in details, and it will be very, very clear, you know, as regards to the explanation and understanding. So far, do we have any question? Is there any question before we dismiss this meeting? Is there any question that we want to, something that is not clear? Or Dr. Bolanle? Dr. Bolanle, how is the pathology going?
Okay, just I think I need to um go through the video. All right.
Okay, okay, that's
Can you hear
fine.
me?
Yes, yes, we can. That's fine.
Oh,
Dr. Princess, Dr. Princess, hope is making sense. Hello?
Hi. Oh yes.
Okay, so Dr.
We have
Robert,
been.
what about you? Dr. Robert?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So Dr. Dilly, are you there? Dr. Dilly? Oh, Dr. Dilly? I think she's trying to speak.
Yes, Dr. Babs.
Okay,
Yeah.
Dr. Dilly.
Hello?
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you, Dr. Dilly. That's fine. We get you. Okay. So please guys, if you have any difficulty understanding any part, I think we can just
Okay.
go to the video and try to nest or try to move the video to that exact point that we don't understand so that we can have a full grasp of it again. I know we have said a lot of things and quite abstract, so I understand if we are still getting some parts mixed up and all those things. So by the time we get to the video, we can look at it into details, and if there's any part that you guys don't get, you can message me personally. I'll shed more light on it. So we are going to dismiss this meeting now. We are going to meet on Monday in the morning by 6 a.m. by God's grace. Okay. So bye bye everybody.